The act of zealotry, Pinchas, the Torah tells us, V'chaper al bnei Yisrael, he atoned for the Jewish people for what happened. So the Balaturim writes, grammatically speaking, it doesn't say V'kiper. V'kiper means, and he atoned, and that's past. V'chaper, the connotation is, there's an ongoing kapara, an ongoing atonement. So he says something phenomenal, that the act of Pinchas not only does atone for the present, for that particular moment, but any future claim against us, against the Jewish people, that act addresses whatever that shortcoming is, and it will atone for the Jewish people. That's the Baal Torah, because otherwise you should have said kiper. Vechaper means there's an ongoing atonement. I mean, it was such a profound action. It's never ending in terms of the value of it. It's like we say in Shemon Esrei, Zochechas be'avos, that the accomplishments of the avos were so phenomenal, so almost on an infinite level. Till today, we still draw on their account. That's what they achieved in their own lifetime. So this act was so profound. Even in the future, when we need kapora, we need atonement, that act will attribute to that atonement. Where do we find something similar? We find that Yitzchak, after Avram passed away, he was in the land of Plishtim, the Philistine location, and there was a famine, and he wanted to leave the land, and he thought to himself, just as my father, when he was confronted with the famine, he went to Egypt, he's going also to Egypt. So Hashem says to Yitzchak, stay in the land, do not go to Egypt. Do not go, and you'll succeed despite the famine. So the Midrash tells us, Hashem says to Yitzchak, just as when you have a sin offering, if it's in the sanctuary, and you take it out of the sanctuary, because you take it out of its confines, it becomes invalidated with the invalidation called Yotzei. It was taken out of its confines. If you leave the borders of Canaan, which is considered the Holy Land, you'll become invalidated because you're a korban, because you're a sacrifice. He was considered the unblemished sacrifice. So the obvious question is, which I asked, if I have a sin offering and I consecrate it, bring it into the Azor, bring it into the sanctuary, and then take it out, the sin offering doesn't become disqualified because I took it out of the sanctuary. It's only once you slaughter it and you begin the avoda, until the avoda is complete, if you, in the midst of the process of the avoda, if you take it out of the confines, you disqualify the korban. But as long as the korban is alive, you could, even if you brought it in, you can take it out, doesn't mean disqualifying. So if that's the case, what is Hashem saying to Yitzchak? Since you are the equivalent of a korban, you are the olet tmima, the unblemished burnt offering. If you should leave Eretz Yisrael, Canaan, you'll be disqualified. That's the question I asked. So what I said was, on Rosh Hashanah, we know that the Akedah is crucial, and we say over there, we say, Afro shel Yitzchak tzovel l'fanecha, that until the end of time, the ash of Yitzchak is piled before God's eyes, and whenever there's any prosecution against the Jewish people, and Hashem sees that ash, that Yitzchak, that the ram was brought in the place of Yitzchak, which Avraham Avinu had brought, that ash atones for the Jewish people, and that quells the prosecution of Satan. So what I wanted to say, that until the end of time, we're in the middle of the avoda. We haven't finished. We see Yitzchak as the slaughtered. Once it's complete, the avoda, the service is completed, there's no disqualification of Yotzei. But as long as the avoda is still in effect, we're in the middle of the avoda. If you take it out of its confines, it becomes disqualified. So because the Akedah stands in our stead till the end of time, it's an ongoing atonement, and it's still toning, therefore we're in the middle of the service. In the middle of the service, it becomes disqualified. So it's similar to what we're saying now, what the Torah says, that the act of Pinchas was so magnanimous, so unending, that not only did it atone for the Jews in that moment, they shouldn't be destroyed, but any prosecution to the future, which will put us in jeopardy, spiritual jeopardy, that act addresses that issue into the future. We know that Rabbi Akiva was the greatest of the 10 martyrs. He was the greatest. He says that, and he was just not killed, he was literally butchered to death. And when he passed away as a result of being tortured the way he was, he said, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elkeinu Hashem Echad. And when he said the word Echad, he expired, his neshama left. And it said, the Baskol came out, a heavenly voice said that just as you said Echad, your soul is pure and you're pure. So the Or Chaim HaKadosh writes that Reb Kiva's, what was needed then, the 10 martyrs were needed for Kapparas. We read on the service of Musaf on Yom Kippur, we read on Tisha B'Av in the Kinos, that it was to atone for the sin of the Mechiras Yosef. The 10 martyrs correspond to the 10 brothers who were involved in the sale of Yosef, and we had it to be atoned. So it was to atone for the past. So he writes, the Or Chaim HaKadosh, that Reb Kiva's act of sacrifice, of giving his life for Kiddush Hashem, that schus stands in the stead of Klal Yisrael to the end of time, that minimizes or quells or silences the prosecution against Klal Yisrael. That's how magnanimous that act was of Rabbi Akiva, that he was willing to give his life, even if it meant dying the most difficult of all the 10 martyrs. That's what he writes over there. There was a person, his name was Avram ben Avram. He was the famous prince of Poland who converted to Judaism, and he was pursued by the Franciscan order because in the 1700s, if a Christian converted to Judaism, was punished by death, and he was in hiding, and he was the heir of all Poland because he was the only son of the king of Poland, and he was meant to be the king. And he so-called abdicated the throne to become a Jew. And they were looking for him high and low. Finally, somebody informed where he was, and they captured him, and they told him that he's going to be put to death and he's going to be burnt at the stake. His name was Avram ben Avram. As a ger, he was called Avram, the son of Avram. He was Graf Petetsky. That was what his name was, Prince Petetsky. And so they said, however, because you're the Prince of Poland, normally, even if you want to retract and go back to Christianity, it's punishable by death. But because you're the Prince of Poland and you make a public declaration that you regret what you did, you could assume the throne, and we won't put you to death. He says, no, I will die on behalf of God. I'm a Jew. I will remain a Jew, and I'll die as a Jew. So there was a major public event. The Poles came from hundreds of miles around, and they built this large bonfire, and they burnt him. They burnt him to death. And as they were burning him to death, he said a bracha al Kiddush Hashem, because he was dying al Kiddush Hashem, sanctify God's name. And he said, Shema Yisrael Hashem al Kiddush Hashem Echad. And as he said that, he was totally consumed by the fire. So the Vilna Gaon writes, the Gemara tells us in Shabbos that in the morning when we awaken, you have to wash your hands a certain way, ultimately, minimally 3 times, because there's a contaminated spirit which are on the hands as a result of sleeping, which could be devastating, or is devastating, to our physical and spiritual standing. And therefore, you have to remove that impurity, and this impure force, it's called bas teo. That's what it's called. It says if you put your hands to your eyes, to your mouth, or you touch food, you're contaminated, and it can be detrimental to your health. So the Vilna Gaon says that as a result of what this Count Petitsky did as a ger, he wasn't willing to go back, and he openly sanctified Hashem's name at that level in the presence of thousands and thousands of Christians, despite being put to death as he was. That koach hatuma, that impure state of our hands will wake up, which is normally so devastating, was minimized, because always anything in which represents spiritual purity represents the nether forces. That positive force that was created, dynamic by Count Patensky, Avram Benov giving his life, minimized the power of the nether force till the end of time. That's what the Vilna Gaon wrote about his act of giving his life, of sanctifying Hashem's name, which is a similar concept as Rebbe Akiva, Pinchas, and all these various situations. After the story of Balpor, the Jews are counted, and we review all the families, and we come to Levi. We speak about the story of Adas Korach. The community of Korach was swallowed by the ground, and Dasan Aviram, and 250 people had brought the fire pans. Then it said, Ubnei Korach lo mesu. The sons of Korach did not die. So I asked then, why do we juxtapose that to the congregation of of Korach being swallowed up by the ground? So what I said was that what had misled Korach to believe that he'd be the sole survivor, because he had seen through his divine vision that Shmuel Novi would be his descendant, and if he would perish at this moment, there's no Shmuel Novi. So if there's be a Shmuel Novi, that means he's going to survive. He's going to be the lone survivor. But what didn't he understand? That two of his sons, they did tshuva. And Shmuel Novi is a descendant of one of those two sons. But it's something he believed wasn't going to happen, but it did happen. That two sons of Korach did tshuva. Now, it's interesting. There's a Tosas in Zvochim that asks a question. What's the halacha if a Kohen receives the blood, and the blood falls out of the blood that he's going to sprinkle on the Mizbeach, and he has to gather it up? We say that if a korban, in the midst of the service, it's interrupted. For instance, if let's say you bring a korban, you slaughter it, and the Mizbeach becomes damaged, chipped. The stone becomes chipped. Now, if the Mizbeach is damaged, you cannot bring a korban on the Mizbeach. It has to be perfect. So if you're in the midst of the service and the Mizbeach becomes damaged, since the momentum or the dynamic of the korban was in effect, it becomes invalidated. Because since it was interrupted in the midst, that korban is no longer qualified to be brought. You have to bring another korban. It's called dichoy. It's pushed off. If it's pushed off even for a moment, it cannot be reinstated. Okay? So therefore, if the Kohen, let's say, has blood, is carrying the blood, and he drops it on the floor, on the ground, and he has to gather the blood. Since he has to gather the blood, that's considered an interruption of the service, and therefore, he has to start all over again. He has to bring another korban, slaughter it, new receiving of the blood, and all the various aspects of the avodah have to be repeated. But the Gemara says in Zvachim, what happens if you have a depression in the ground, and the blood falls out of his hand, it falls into depression, and he's able to scoop it up immediately, just pick it up, basically without any interruption, although he dropped it. We don't say decoy. That since it can be done quickly, it's not he has to gather it, he just bends down, picks it up, and continues. That's not called an interruption. That's what the Gemara says. So Tosa asks a question, what's the halacha? A person goes and inadvertently violates Shabbos. Now I'm teaching you Zvachim here. Kochim. And he consecrates a chatos, a sin offering. And after he consecrates the sin offering, he becomes a heretic. Heretic. Meaning when he inadvertently violated Shabbos, he was a full committed Jew. Afterwards, consecrates the chatos, now he becomes a heretic. Doesn't keep Shabbos any longer. The korban that he had consecrated as a chatos, the sin offering, becomes invalidated. Why? Because based on the posuk, a korban of a heretic cannot be brought. And let's say now he does tshuva. If he does tshuva, and now he's qualified to bring the korban, but since there was a moment when he became the heretic that the korban was invalidated, the korban's not reinstated. That's the halacha. So Tosas asks, but as we see with the blood, if something is within the person's ability to bring about, we don't say dichoy. It's not considered interrupted. So since every person can do tshuva, why when the person consecrates the chatos, the sin offering, becomes the heretic, why isn't it validated? He can do tshuva. He's able to do tshuva. And since it's within his ability to do tshuva, it should not be disqualified. That's Tosas' question in Zvachim. So Tosas answers, to do tshuva is not so simple. When the blood drops out of his hand and falls into depression, scooping it up, that's easy. But if a person becomes a heretic, to come back, it's not so simple. And because it's not simple, therefore it's considered an interruption of status, and therefore the korban is disqualified. That's Tosas' answer. Okay? Now, Korach's two sons were part of this mutiny against Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, Korach sees in his divine vision, his descendants could be Shmuel and Navi. Now, how could Shmuel be in the future if he's going to die? Since maybe there's a consideration, his sons will do tshuva. Not possible. One doesn't do tshuva. You need a special siyata d'shmai to do tshuva. So in his mind, definite they want to do tshuva. So if that's the case, if he's Shmuel and Navi in his divine vision, it must be he's the lone survivor. Now, I mentioned a Medrash. Medrash says, at the last moment, Moshe came into the tent of Korach to try to reason with him. And his two sons, one was sitting to his right, one was sitting to his left. And they had a dilemma. They were in a quandary. Should they stand for Moshe Rabbeinu to acknowledge his greatness? Because he was Rabban Shel Yisrael, he was the teacher of Klal Yisrael. He received the Torah at Sinai. Or no, that since it would be a disrespect to their father, they're going to sit. What did they decide? They decided they're going to stand to acknowledge Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Medrash says, in the merit that they stood to acknowledge Moshe, Hashem allowed them to have stirrings of tshuva in their heart, and that's ultimately why they did tshuva. But if they wouldn't have done that action, where they weren't coming back. They were gone forever. But because they did this special act, that they stood for Moshe, honoring, acknowledging Moshe's greatness, Hashem intervened and gave them that sense. And only because of that, they were able to do tshuva. So you see, again, tshuva is not something which comes easily. You need special divine assistance, and they needed merit. The merit was because they acknowledged Moshe Rabbeinu. Therefore, Korach, where he was coming from, his sons are not doing tshuva over here. Not back, and especially he believed he was in the right. And he couldn't believe there's any chance that they're going to want the Moshe side of the equation here. But because this was special divine intervention, that's the reason why Korach's children did not perish. Portion, we speak about the laws of vows and oaths. And the nullification, when one makes a neder, which is a vow, one is bound to that vow or to that oath. We'll speak of what's the difference between a vow and an oath. And it says, the Torah says, you're not permitted to profane your vow or oath. Lo yachol dvaro. Pasuk Gimel. Ish ki do net l'Hashem. Person makes a vow to Hashem. Oh, Yishal Ashur. Or takes an oath. Lesser Yisur al Nafsho. To create a provision on himself. Lo yachol dvaro. He's not permitted to profane his words. From the word chulin. He must follow whatever he had articulated. Let's take a little Rashi. What's a neder? Omeharei olai kodim shlo ochal or shlo esed of a plomi. Person says, I accept upon myself that this item is off limits to me. The difference between a neder and a shvu is a neder, a vow is the object. The object is off limits. An oath is, I will not eat. I will not go. We're not talking about an object, it's the person. One is directed at the location or the object, and the other is addressed to the person himself. What you will do, what you won't do. One's a neder, one's a shvur. Of course, violating an oath is much more severe than violating a neder, because a neder does not have relevance to the name of Hashem. A shvur, you swear in the name of God, Hashem, so therefore it's much more severe. So over here, it says, Yochel afil nishba shochel nevelos. Maybe a person swears he will not eat non-kosher meat. Is that a valid shvur? Is that an oath? Anikore olav kol yitzriv yasir. You'd say everything that comes out, you articulate, you verbalize, you're bound. Talmud loma lesser isur. A vow or an oath is an oath is only something where you prohibit something. What's the inference when you prohibit? Said meaning if already was forbidden before, it has no relevance to an oath. Lesser is amutum lo latir also. Two things. It comes to prohibit something that's permitted, and not to prohibit something that's forbidden. The person swears, "I will eat not kosher." It says it's an oath in vain. He gets malchus because it doesn't hold any water. But even if you swear you will not eat non-kosher meat, it's not an oath because non-kosher meat is not permitted in either case. So therefore, the oath is superfluous. That's saying that's considered taking an oath in vain, and it's a Torah prohibition. Lo yachal dvaro, lo yichal dvaro. Yachal means you should not desecrate your word. Lo yasud dvaro chulin. Your word should not be as ordinary. You speak ordinary talk, whether it has significance, doesn't have significance, doesn't make a difference. When you make an oath or a vow, you take an oath or a vow, you're bound by it, and you what? And therefore, if you violate it, you're in violation of negative commandment. Okay, now. We read that we studied the laws of Mitzorah. Why does one become a leper? One becomes a leper because he speaks Lashon Hara. It's an abuse of the power of speech. The power of speech was misappropriated. And if a person crosses the line too many times at an extreme level, he becomes persona non grata, he becomes a leper, and he has to go out of all the camps. That's the most extreme level of impurity, that he cannot be in any of the camps, and he remains there until he recovers. That's the law of the Mitzorah. The Mitzorah, the impurity of Mitzorah is identical to the impurity of the dead. If you're under the same roof with the remains of a human being, you become contaminated. If you're in the same room with a Mitzorah, he generates a level of contamination, you become contaminated. What he sits on is contaminated, where he goes is contaminated. He becomes the equivalent of an abomination. Not only is he a pariah, that he's outside the community, the equivalent of the most extreme level of excommunication, his essence becomes something which generates an impurity, because he spoke Lashon Hara. So why does it come about? It's a result of an abuse of speech. You're endowed with speech, and because you desecrated your speech at a certain level, you become a Mitzorah. Normally, we say that you're not bound unless you do an action. If you want to acquire something, you must acquire it. You have to do a physical act. But to bring about prohibition, if you say words within the context of an oath or a vow, that item, that object becomes off limit, or that action, you're not permitted to do that action any longer. Now the question is, words have tremendous significance to a greater degree than action. What's the difference between the power of speech and action? Action is what? It's a physical act. The Gemara says that words are lav sheba maser. When you speak, it's not considered something tangible. But yet, in terms of, as we read here, in terms of the seriousness of violating one's speech, it has a very extreme level of liability. One gets malchus. You violate your vow, you get malchus. But it was words. Now, when we speak about leprosy by the Mitzorah, are we speaking about the conventional leprosy, or are we speaking about something unrelated? So all the Rishonim, the commentators explain, the leprosy of a Mitzorah is not the degenerative neurological disease that a person totally degenerates. That's not what it is. It's purely a tag. It's a discoloration on the skin, which indicates that you've crossed the line. and this is evaluated by the Kohen. If he sees it has a certain intense level of color, he's classified and branded as a Metzora. So it's not a breakdown of one's physicality. Now, the question is, every other transgression, how does it manifest itself? It always manifests itself in what? In something physical. Cancer, heart attack, whatever it is. Person falls off a roof. There are many ways where God's justice is what is implemented as a result of sin. But yet, when it comes to Lashon Hara, it's purely, there's no breakdown of the physicality of the person. It's purely a label, you're a Mitzorah. It's like an indicator that where you're at. Now the question is why. So we once had mentioned the Gemara in Tainus. The Gemara says in Tainus, at the end of time, there's going to be a tribunal of animals, and they're going to put the snake on trial. The snake, mentioned the Gemara in the past Gemara in Tainus. So the court says to the snake, we understand the lion. When the lion kills its prey, it kills the prey to satisfy its food need. When the bear attacks its victim and literally dismembers and tears them apart and drags the remains of whatever that animal is or person to its lair, it's for its food needs. But the snake, when it bites its victim and leaves the victim to die, where there's no benefit from killing that, whatever that species, that creature, what benefit do you have from this? It doesn't fit the profile of an animal. So the snake will respond to that tribunal. He says, "Umay yisla b'al lashon." He says, "Am I any worse than the one who speaks lashon hara, where he bites its victim, and he leaves its victim to be damaged, to be hurt, and goes off?" What is the Gemara talking about? What does a person sin? A human being is a composite of the spiritual and the physical. You have a neshama, you have a body. The body itself represents all physical drives. All challenges emanate from the physical, not from the spiritual. If you read the Mesilas Yesharim, the challenge of life is a tug of war between the neshama, the spiritual, and the physical. Who has the upper hand? The soul can spiritualize the physical. Although you're always vulnerable to the influence of the evil inclination. But the physical could overwhelm the soul, and a person could become a total physical being. It's called Nefesh HaBahamis. Every human being has an animalistic component to it. All the drives of animalistic tendencies exist within the human being. And that's the struggle between the soul and the body. So when a person sins, why do you sin? Why do you eat not kosher? Why do you violate Shabbos? Why does a person violate certain sexual relationships? Why? The answer is because he has that drive. That drive emanates from the physical. And it manifests itself in the physical. Lashon Hara doesn't manifest itself in the physical. And that's what they said. All the animals, whatever they do, that's because that's the animalistic characteristic. But not to have any benefit other than just the sense of destroying something, that's not part of the animalistic profile. As a result of that, therefore, you're more culpable, he says, and the human being is any better than I am. Why am I worse than the human being? And he quotes the pasuk from Mishlei, "My yishul ba'al lashon." Why is the ba'al lashon any better than I am, the one who speaks lashon hara? Now, every sin, since it emanates from the physical, so the punishment manifests itself in the physical. But lashon hara has nothing to do with the physical. Now, what have you abused? What have you desecrated? You've desecrated what? Your words, your power of speech. And this is the Chofetz Chaim writes. If you take a look in Targum Onkelos, when Hashem infused Adam with a neshama, the Torah tells us, "Vahila nefesh chaya." He became a living species. And the Targum Mukla says, when he was infused with the neshama, he became a speaking species. Meaning the power of speech emanates from the soul. It has nothing to do with the physicality of the body. An animal doesn't speak because it doesn't have a soul. Which has to do with intelligence. A human being, because that's an expression of the neshama. Speech. So when you violate your word, there's an expression in English, one's word is sacred. Sacred. You don't say one's action is sacred. Why is one's speech sacred? Because since the power of speech emanates from the neshama, which is the holiest entity, which exists in existence, it's holier than the holiest angel. As a result of that, speech, which is a derivative of that, is sacred. So when you speak, and when you're bound through a neder or oath, when you violate that, what you're desecrating something which is sacred, which is holy. Therefore, the liability is a very serious liability. Although you didn't do an action, just words, it has an effect. And therefore, the Gemara tells us in Shavuos, God forbid a person who violates his oaths or his vows, God forbid, it could cause that his wife and children should die. God forbid. More than any other sin. Why? Why is this more extreme? Because again, this is a violation of the spiritual. It's not just desecrating the physical. Physical is not sacred. It's not holy. Unless you consecrate it. But how does consecration come about? Consecration comes about through a verbal designation. That's how you consecrate something. The power of speech goes and designates something to be exclusive for God. That's how it becomes consecrated. One doesn't do an action. The power of speech is enough to bring about that level of exclusivity in terms of that item, that object.
I have two questions.
Ervin, student who was studying and he didn't verbalize when he was studying, studied silently. And Bruria, who was the wife of Remeir, walks by and she reprimands him. And she says, don't you realize you're really wasting your time? Because the pasuk says, Chaim hi l'motzeyim. When you study Torah, it's life l'motzeyim. What's l'motzeyim? Misha motzi b'peh. When does it bring about the ultimate level of life? When you verbalize it. Torah has to be verbalized. That's what the pasuk says. So therefore, the full effect of Torah in terms of the personal, what it generates in the world, comes through the power of speech. So ultimately, when did the human being become a spiritual species? When he was infused with the neshama. What's a direct outgrowth of that? He became a speaking species. So the reason why the human being speaks originally, it's the Jew. Originally, all humanity was supposed to be the represent Adam, but they forfeited that classification was through speech to generate spirituality. We who were chosen to be the Adam, and we were given the Torah, so and the purpose of existence is the study of Torah, how's that expressed? Which is the ultimate in spirituality, it's through the power of speech. Because man was endowed with speech only for that. So if you go and you misappropriate that speech, it's a problem. Speak Lashon Hara. Rather than generate positive, you generate the most negative. It's such an extreme level of misappropriation. Therefore, it has these serious consequences. Or you make a vow, which is the ultimate, or a shua, and you violate it. There's this very serious consequence, and that's why speech is sacred, and therefore when you violate speech, it's called lo yechalem. You're profaning your speech for that reason. Lashon Hara, as well as Homen Russia. He originally, when he came to seal the fate of the Jews, to bring about the decree, lahashmid la'arog la'abed, minarva zoki tafid noshim, every man, woman, and child should be annihilated. He comes to Achashverosh and says, you got a people who live among your subjects. They don't respect you. They violate and they desecrate your honor. And he gave examples. And he focused in a way, it was like a laser criticism. And as a result of that, besides he gave him a tremendous amount of money, says he removed his ring, which was, that gave him permission to see the fate of the Jews. But it says there was nobody who could speak Lishna Bisha, Lashon Hara, like Homer. So he took the power of speech, which is the ultimate, and he used it as what? In the most negative. We find Bilam, we read in this week's Parsha, he was killed by the sword. Why was he killed by the sword? Because he took our profile, which is the power of speech, a Kokol Yaakov, and he wanted to misuse it. It was a misappropriation to curse us. So we took his characteristic, which is the sword, and we killed him by the sword. But again, speech is lethal. It's lethal if you misappropriate it. But if you apply it in the right context, it brings about the ultimate. When you give a bracha is what? Is you verbalize it. God forbid, a klala, a curse is also verbalized. One is in the negative, one's in the positive, but they both have effects. A positive effect and a very detrimental negative effect. The Gemara tells us, Al te birchas hedge kal beinecha. You shouldn't even take the blessing of an ordinary person lightly. That since he's blessing you, don't minimize the value of that blessing, even an ordinary person. And that says, Al te killas hedge kal beinecha. If God forbid, even an ordinary person curses you, don't underestimate the effect of that curse. It could bring about terrible, terrible consequences. Therefore, try to avoid it in the worst way. Not to be in that line of fire of a person, God forbid, if he wants to curse you.